Chapter 1. White Dress and Black Shadow. The morning unfolded like a staged photograph. Sunlight on polished mirrors, flowers in vases, a dress suspended like a pale cloud from a brass hook. Everything shimmered with the promise of perfection, yet she moved through it with a steadiness that came not from joy, but from resolve. The night before had given her no rest. A message had arrived, ordinary in appearance, carrying files that ended her innocence in a single click. She had watched the video again and again, not for cruelty but for certainty. His jacket, his watch, his hand resting on another woman's waist where her own had once belonged. The setting was anonymous, a hotel room without personality, but the betrayal was unmistakable. At first she had thought to cancel everything, to save herself the spectacle. But that instinct passed, replaced by something quieter, sharper. The day already promised an audience, a stage, a screen. Why waste what circumstance had arranged? She saved the clips, backed them up, and placed them into the folder already prepared for wedding slideshows. The decision, once made, calmed her like cool water on a burn. By dawn, she had her plan. The ceremony would proceed, but not as a declaration of love. It would become a revelation of truth. Her reflection in the mirror was a stranger at first, a woman framed by lace and pearl, but the longer she looked, the more familiar she became. Not a bride abandoned by fate, but a witness preparing her own testimony. The dress was not fragile. It was armor. The bouquet hid a remote clicker, ordinary enough to pass unnoticed, but heavy with meaning. She allowed the rituals to continue around her. Friends adjusted her veil, photographers arranged her shoes, and hands pinned her hair into gleaming arcs. She let them believe in a different story, carrying their faith like an extra weight she would soon set down. No one saw the phone lying face down, already relieved of its burden. No one guessed that vows written weeks earlier now lay discarded beside the untouched ring. The ride to the venue felt dreamlike, the city sliding by in fragments. A child tugged a balloon down the sidewalk. A cyclist leaned at a red light. Shop windows glimmered with cakes and bread. All of it looked strangely distant, as though the world belonged to another life. The building rose into view, solemn and proud, prepared to host joy, but about to house truth instead. Inside, flowers and candles performed their roles, chairs lined up in obedient rows, guests arriving in clusters of color and laughter. To them, this was still a wedding day, but within her, a different architecture had been built. Columns of certainty, beams of evidence, foundations of betrayal too solid to collapse. She thought little of vengeance, less of pity. She thought only of balance. The scales had been tipped, and now they would return to level. She stepped from the car, her train gathered carefully, her eyes steady. To everyone watching, she was the bride they expected, composed, luminous, ready to speak forever. But within her bouquet lay the quiet trigger of revelation. The moment would come, not at the altar, but on the screen, when the projection lowered and images replaced illusions. This day would not mark the binding of two lives. It would mark the unraveling of a lie, shown not in whispers, but in the clear light of an audience. She walked forward, the white dress trailing behind her, carrying not vows, but truth, prepared to let the world see the shadow that had been hiding all along. Chapter 2. The Blow at the Altar. The music ebbed into silence, leaving only the faint echo of strings vibrating in the vaulted ceiling. Guests rose as one, the movement a ripple of fabric and anticipation. Their eyes locked on the long white aisle, a narrow path that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the altar. She advanced slowly, each step measured, the dress trailing in perfect obedience, the bouquet held steady against her chest. Cameras clicked softly, recording what appeared to be the beginning of a lifelong vow. At the far end, he waited with hands clasped too tightly in front of him, his jaw stiffened into restraint. His eyes, once familiar and bright, now appeared detached, glazed with a chill that betrayed a decision long made, but not yet spoken. He did not shift his weight or smile. He simply stood as if caught between duty and escape. The crowd misread his stillness as solemnity, mistaking hesitation for reverence. Only she recognized it for what it was, a sign of fracture already widening. The officiant's voice carried into the hush, words polished by centuries of repetition, phrases about unity, fidelity, and permanence. Each syllable seemed to toll like a bell, yet before the rhythm could gather momentum, his voice broke through, sharp and sudden. 3 words, spoken with no tremor, cut across the room like a blade through fabric. I cannot. The effect was instantaneous. Gasps rose from the front rows, spreading backward like fire racing through dry grass. A woman's hand flew to her mouth, muffling disbelief. A chair scraped against stone as someone shifted uncomfortably. The silence that followed was not absence but pressure, heavy and suffocating, as if the walls themselves recoiled. He lowered his gaze, unable to withstand the collective weight of the stares now fixed upon him. The words, though brief, hung in the air long after they were spoken, echoing within minds that searched for sense. Some wondered if they had misheard, if the strain of emotion had bent the syllables into false meaning. But the stillness of his shoulders, the absence of correction, made it clear. Her breath caught, but her body did not falter. For a heartbeat, the hall believed it witnessed her collapse, the ruin of expectation, the shattering of a bride's dream. The audience saw fragility where none existed, mistaking composure for shock. Yet behind her lowered lashes, her mind moved with the precision of a plan already forged. Around them, whispers thickened. Guests exchanged glances charged with confusion, pity, or voyeuristic thrill. The spectacle of a broken wedding drew its own gravity, pulling every eye and thought into the unfolding calamity. Some leaned forward as if distance might grant clarity. Others looked away, unable to endure the raw exposure of a private fracture made public. The officiant hesitated, words caught in his throat, his script abruptly useless. No ritual prepared him for refusal at the moment of binding. His silence only magnified the rupture, leaving the weight of explanation unspoken. He shifted then, hands unclasping, fingers flexing as though seeking an exit. His face betrayed no sorrow, only the burden of release. It was not a cry for help, but a finality, delivered without remorse. She stood opposite him, veil framing her features in a fragile border, but her eyes revealed no collapse. She did not plead or question. Instead, she held herself upright, her spine aligned with the aisle behind her, as though the long walk had not been toward him but toward this very revelation. To the crowd, the moment was devastation. To her, it was confirmation. What seemed like ruin to others was only the first crack in a performance carefully staged. They believed she was the abandoned bride, shattered in white lace. They could not see the truth concealed in her calm, that the final move had always belonged to her. Chapter 3. The Video of Truth. The chaos at the altar had begun to swell, murmurs rippling through the guests like a tide that threatened to drown the moment. But before the noise could overwhelm the room, she raised her hand. The gesture was simple, almost delicate, yet it commanded immediate silence. The crowd obeyed without understanding why, instinctively sensing that something greater was about to unfold. Her movements were calm, measured against the storm that everyone else felt. She turned slightly toward the technician waiting near the edge of the hall. A nod, barely perceptible, was enough. The lights dimmed by a fraction, and the large screen that had been prepared for sentimental photographs flickered away. Guests leaned forward in expectation, assuming a slideshow of childhood images and shared memories would follow, something to remind them of love and longevity. Instead, the screen became a window into a different truth. The footage began abruptly, without introduction. Grainy at first, then sharpening into the unmistakable figure of the groom. He was in a hotel room, one she had recognized the night before, his jacket tossed carelessly over a chair, his watch glinting under artificial light. Another figure entered the frame, a woman, her hair falling across her shoulders, her body pressing close with an intimacy no camera could mistake. His arms encircled her, his mouth found hers, and the kiss carried a hunger that had long since withered in his touch for his bride. The hall froze. Sound vanished. The only noise was the low hum of the projector and the steady pulse of the video's audio, muted yet undeniable. The silence thickened, oppressive, as though the air itself had been turned to glass. Every breath from the audience seemed to echo, amplifying the stillness. No one moved, not even the children who had grown restless minutes before. On the screen, the betrayal continued unhurried, cruel in its casualness. He held the other woman as if she were the only person in the world, unaware that another pair of eyes now watched from every corner of the hall. Each guest, each family member, saw his infidelity not as rumor or suspicion, but as undeniable fact. His actions filled the room in a way no denial could erase. The bride stood unwavering at the front, her face composed, her body still. She did not need to speak. The images carried more weight than words ever could. She had become both witness and judge, allowing the evidence to render its own verdict. The guests shifted in their seats, some leaning forward with hands pressed to their lips, others turning pale under the weight of recognition. He, the groom, grew visibly smaller with each passing second. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin ashen under the bright lights. His hands twitched at his sides, restless, searching for some anchor, but finding none. His eyes darted across the hall, seeking escape. Yet the screen betrayed him again and again, replaying every caress, every kiss, every betrayal in merciless clarity. The guest's silence was no longer simply shock. It was judgment, collective and heavy. Their eyes condemned him. Their stillness was sharper than any shouted accusation. He had hoped to walk away quietly, leaving her broken before an audience. But now it was his name, his honor, his dignity crumbling in public view. She remained unmoved, her expression controlled, her presence commanding. The room no longer belonged to him, nor to the ceremony. It belonged to her, to the truth she had unleashed, to the justice served not in anger, but in revelation. The video ended not with a flourish, but with a blank screen, the silence stretching even longer now that the evidence was gone. No applause, no words, only the echo of betrayal seared into the minds of all who had witnessed it. And in that silence, his downfall was complete. Chapter 4. The Audience of Betrayal. The hall remained suspended in silence long after the screen went dark. The faint hum of the projector faded, yet its images clung to the minds of those who had watched, refusing to release them. Rows of guests shifted uneasily, bodies angled one way or another, searching for somewhere to direct the weight of their discomfort. The divide was immediate, visible in posture and gaze. Some turned their heads sharply, unwilling to meet his eyes, as though looking at him now might make them complicit. Others allowed their attention to linger on her, softened by pity, mistaking her poise for fragility. But the majority fixed their stares on him, expressions hardened with condemnation, disgust written into every line of their faces. The mother of the groom sank low in her seat, her back curving as though she could fold herself into invisibility. Her hands twisted a handkerchief that had been prepared for tears of joy, but now absorbed only the sweat of humiliation. She avoided the eyes of her neighbors, unwilling to see the reflection of shame mirrored back at her. Nearby, the father of the groom sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his knuckles pale against the polished wood of the pew, as though grasping for dignity that no longer belonged to their family. The groom's friends, who had once laughed loudest at his jokes and slapped his back with pride, now looked at the floor, their loyalty evaporating under the weight of exposure. None dared defend him. None sought to explain away what had been witnessed. Silence was their only refuge, but even silence accused. Every lowered gaze was another sentence handed down, another layer of betrayal reversed onto the man who had once prided himself on control. Her presence at the front remained unshaken. She stood tall, her veil framing her face like marble, her stillness commanding more power than any outburst could have achieved. There were no tears streaking her cheeks, no trembling hands clutching the bouquet. She was not the abandoned bride they had imagined minutes earlier. She was something else entirely, an embodiment of calm retribution, a statue carved from the very material of truth. Each guest became a witness not to her ruin, but to his collapse. Every eye that lingered on him forced him deeper into the pit he had dug for himself. What he had believed hidden behind closed doors had now been paraded under the unforgiving light of ceremony, and with each silent judgment cast upon him, the reality of his downfall solidified. The whispers that spread through the hall carried not her name, but his, each repetition of it laced with contempt. The space itself seemed transformed. What had been arranged as a sanctuary of vows and blessings had turned into a tribunal. The flowers, once symbols of celebration, became like offerings left at the site of his disgrace. The altar, dressed for a promise of union, now stood as the stage of his unmasking. The air was thick with the weight of collective betrayal, not hers, but his, borne witness by every guest present. He shifted under the scrutiny, his shoulders hunched, his complexion pale, the sweat at his temple glistening under the harsh lights. He opened his mouth once, as if to speak, but the words collapsed before they formed. No justification could survive against the images still seared in memory, and no apology could soften the iron wall of judgment surrounding him. She did not move. Her silence was more eloquent than any accusation. She had no need to scream, no need to explain. The truth had spoken on her behalf, and the audience had already delivered its verdict. It was not her defeat. It was his ending. Chapter 5. The Groom's Fall. The silence that had cloaked the hall fractured at last, not with voices of support, but with his own desperate movements. He stumbled a step forward, his hands raised as if grasping for invisible ropes that might pull him back to safety. Words spilled from his lips, broken fragments that scattered in the air without meaning. His mouth formed apologies, explanations, denials, but each syllable collapsed under the weight of the images still burning in memory. Every gesture, every frantic shake of the head, only deepened the portrait of ruin. What once had been promises engraved in rings and vows rehearsed in secret now seemed grotesque echoes of a man incapable of honor. All the speeches he had delivered in private about loyalty, about love, dissolved instantly, eclipsed by the evidence that no rhetoric could erase. He clung to language the way a drowning man clings to driftwood, yet every word disintegrated before it reached the audience. The more he tried to defend himself, the more pathetic he appeared, flailing in the center of the hall, under the sharp clarity of collective judgment. The guests remained unmoved. Some sat rigid in their seats, arms crossed like jurors awaiting the inevitable conclusion. Others leaned back, faces turned in disgust, unwilling to lend him even the dignity of eye contact. There were no voices offering sympathy, no allies willing to catch him as he fell. The allies he had once trusted, the friends who toasted him, the family who had shielded him, the colleagues who respected him, were all silent now. The betrayal was undeniable, and their silence became the final seal on his guilt. His mother buried her face in her hands, shoulders trembling not with tears of compassion, but with shame that had hollowed her to the bone. His father sat stiff and pale, his reputation bleeding out with every second that passed. Business partners in the back row exchanged glances sharp with calculation, already weighing the cost of association with a man whose mask had slipped so violently. Friends looked to the floor, unwilling to share even the smallest fragment of his humiliation. The groom's own body betrayed him. His face, once polished and confident, was drained of color. Sweat traced lines across his forehead. His tie hung loose where his hands had tugged at it, his movements restless and unsteady. He turned toward her once, as though seeking forgiveness, but found only the still figure of the bride, calm and unyielding, her silence louder than his protests. The contrast between her composure and his collapse carved the scene into permanence. She was the pillar, and he was the ruin. No escape remained. The doors that might have offered him retreat were no longer exits but thresholds of disgrace. To leave would mean to flee, and to stay meant enduring the slow, grinding erosion of whatever reputation he still clung to. Each second prolonged his exposure. Each glance from the guests was another stone added to the weight already crushing him. The ceremony that was meant to elevate him had instead dismantled him, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a shell of desperation. The carefully curated image of a man in control disintegrated, leaving only fragments scattered across the floor like broken glass. His fall was not loud or theatrical, but steady and inescapable. A collapse witnessed in real time by those he had hoped to impress. In the end, it was not rage, nor vengeance, nor even the bride's quiet strength that destroyed him. It was the truth, projected without mercy, reflected in the eyes of everyone present. His world did not explode. It crumbled slowly, relentlessly, under the collective weight of exposure. And in that hall, surrounded by silence that had turned into judgment, the groom was stripped of everything: status, dignity, future. His fall was complete. Chapter 6. Departure in Dignity. The hall still quivered with silence when she reached up with steady hands and lifted the veil from her head. The delicate fabric, once meant to symbolize purity and devotion, now felt weightless as she folded it with deliberate care. Every crease was precise, every motion unhurried, as if the act itself were a quiet ritual of release. She placed the veil on the altar, not as an offering to faith or ceremony, but as a final gesture to mark the end of something already broken. The audience, restless and uncertain, held its breath. There were no words. None were necessary. Her silence pressed into the air with a force more commanding than accusation, heavier than any shouted reproach. Each step she took back from the altar became an assertion of control, an unspoken statement that she would not be diminished by the spectacle. The guests watched her, their gazes shifting from pity to admiration, from shock to respect. In the stillness of her poise, she recast the narrative. She was not abandoned but liberated, not discarded but unshaken. The groom remained rooted in his collapse, his figure diminished against the backdrop of judgment. Yet she did not spare him a glance. His fall belonged to him alone, and she no longer carried its weight. Her attention was forward, fixed on the path between the rows of seats, the long aisle that had brought her here under false promises and now guided her toward freedom. The click of her heels against the polished floor was soft but certain, each sound punctuating her resolve. Whispers rose along the edges of her passage. They carried awe, disbelief, and reluctant admiration, weaving together like threads of acknowledgement that she had turned ruin into triumph. Some guests lowered their eyes in shame for having once pitied her. Others followed her with reverent stillness, as if witnessing a figure who had transcended the humiliation intended for her. None could deny the power of her composure. The space around her seemed to expand as she advanced. The flowers, the candles, the careful decorations, everything that had once been meant to frame a celebration, now became witnesses to her strength. The hall no longer belonged to vows or to failure. It belonged to her exit, to the dignity she carried as she reclaimed herself in front of them all. When she reached the doors, the weight of the air shifted. Beyond the walls lay a world that had not yet absorbed the story of this day, a world unmarked by betrayal or exposure. She pushed the doors open, and the cool rush of air met her like a cleansing tide. The sky was vast, pale, and steady, unshaken by the drama that had just unraveled beneath its reach. She drew in a deep breath, filling her lungs with the freshness of release, and felt the tension of months dissolve with it. The veil remained behind. The altar stood empty. The guests lingered in silence. But none of that mattered. The wedding had not taken place. The promises had not been sealed. And yet she felt no loss. Instead, she felt the clarity of freedom, the certainty that she had preserved her dignity where he had squandered his. The day that should have bound her had instead unbound her. She stepped onto the stone walkway, her posture straight, her gaze unclouded. The world before her was uncertain, but it was hers to claim. She left not as a bride betrayed, but as a woman restored, her silence echoing behind her louder than any vow could ever have been.